The warning came at midnight on a cold January night. Every screen on Earth flickered to life with the same message. The Galactic Council was calling an emergency meeting. Something terrible was coming. Admiral Daniel Harper was sleeping in his small apartment in Houston when his phone rang. He answered it and heard the voice of his aide, Commander Katie Morrison. She told him to get to the United Nations Space Command immediately. He dressed quickly and drove through empty streets to the command center. When he arrived, the room was filled with chaos. Officers ran between stations. Screens showed star maps covered in red markers. Katie met him at the door and handed him a tablet with the latest reports. The Vorthic swarm had entered known space. They were a species that had existed for thousands of years, moving from galaxy to galaxy, consuming everything in their path. They were not interested in peace or trade. They only wanted to feed and grow. Their ships numbered in the billions, and they had never lost a war. Daniel read the reports carefully. 17 star systems had fallen in just 40 days. The Vorthic did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners. They simply arrived, overwhelmed all defenses, and stripped planets bare of all life. The Galactic Council meeting began an hour later. Daniel sat in the human delegation area and watched the holographic display in the center of the chamber. Ambassador Vrenthus of the Kelari species stood before the assembled delegates. He was a tall creature with 4 arms and pale blue skin. His voice shook as he spoke. He told the council that resistance was impossible. The Vorthic had destroyed civilizations far older and more advanced than any currently in the galaxy. Their numbers were endless. Their hunger was infinite. The only option was to run. Daniel watched as the other species began to panic. The Pelori delegation was already packing their equipment. The Syntax were sending evacuation orders to their homeworld. The Makari ambassador simply stood up and walked out without saying a word. Vrenthus called for a full evacuation of Sector 7, which included Earth and all human colonies. He advised every species to retreat beyond the outer rim, a distant region of space where the Vorthic might not follow. He said this was not defeat. It was survival. One by one, the alien delegates fled the chamber. Ships launched from every docking bay around the station. The great meeting hall, which had once been a symbol of galactic cooperation, was being abandoned. Within 2 hours, only the human delegation remained. Katie approached Daniel with concern on her face. She told him their ships were ready. They could make the jump to safe space within the hour. The evacuation fleet was already assembling above Earth to transport as many people as possible. Daniel did not respond immediately. He stared at the star map, watching the red markers spread like a disease across the galaxy. He thought about Earth. He thought about the billions of people who would never make it to safety in time. He thought about his daughter, who lived in Chicago with her 2 children. He thought about every war humanity had ever fought, every moment when someone had told them to give up. He stood up slowly and looked at Katie. He told her they were not running. Katie stared at him in disbelief. She reminded him that the Vorthic had destroyed civilizations older than the entire human species. She told him the council said resistance was suicide. She asked him what he expected to achieve by staying. Daniel walked to the center of the empty chamber and looked up at the star map. He told Katie to get him a secure channel to Earth Command. He wanted every ship mobilized. He wanted every weapon armed. He wanted humanity to prepare for war. Katie asked him if he understood what he was asking. She told him they had maybe 400 combat-ready ships. The Vorthic had millions. The math was simple. They would all die. Daniel turned to face her. For the first time that night, he smiled. He told her the Galactic Council had never met humanity. He told her that humans had faced impossible odds before. They had fought wars against enemies who outnumbered them. They had survived plagues and famines and disasters that should have ended their species. They were still here. He opened a communication channel to Earth. The face of Secretary General Marcus Webb appeared on the screen. Marcus looked exhausted and afraid. He asked Daniel what the council had decided. Daniel told him the council had decided to run. Every species in the galaxy was fleeing to the outer rim. Earth had been abandoned by its allies. They were alone. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. He asked Daniel what he recommended. Daniel told him they had two choices. They could run and hope the Vorthok never followed. They could scatter across the galaxy as refugees, begging other species for shelter. They could watch Earth die from a safe distance. Or they could fight. Marcus asked him honestly what their chances were if they chose to fight. Daniel told him the truth. Their chances were small. Maybe they would all die. Maybe the Vorthig would crush them in days. But if they ran, they would lose everything that made them human. They would spend the rest of their existence as cowards who abandoned their home without firing a single shot. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. He told Daniel to mobilize the fleet. He would address the people of Earth in the morning. The next day, Marcus Webb stood before the United Nations General Assembly. Every screen on Earth carried his speech. He told humanity what was coming. He did not hide the truth or offer false hope. He explained that the Vorthok were the greatest threat their species had ever faced. Then he told them something else. He told them that humanity had decided to fight, not because they were certain of victory, not because they had some secret weapon, but because running was not who they were, because Earth was their home and they would not abandon it. He asked for volunteers. He asked for scientists to develop new weapons. He asked for factory workers to build ships. He asked for soldiers to fly them into battle. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, recruiting stations were flooded with volunteers. Factories that had been closed for years reopened. Scientists worked without sleep to find weaknesses in the Vorthok swarm. Humanity was not going to run. Humanity was going to fight. And if they were going to die, they would die standing up. Admiral Daniel Harper watched the mobilization from his office. Katie stood beside him, looking at reports of ships being prepared and troops being trained. She asked him if he really believed they could win. Daniel watched a group of young pilots boarding a transport outside his window. They were laughing and joking with each other, even though they knew what they were flying toward. He told Katie he did not know if they could win, but he knew one thing for certain. The Vorthok had never faced anything like humanity before, and that alone was worth fighting for. 3 weeks passed after the Galactic Council fled. The human fleet gathered above a small colony world called Meridian Prime. It was a simple planet, home to 40,000 farmers and miners. It had no strategic value. It produced no rare resources. But it was directly in the path of the Vorthok advance, and humanity had decided to make their stand there. General Nathan Cole stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the last evacuation transports leave the planet's surface. Every colonist had been moved to safety. Every building had been emptied. Meridian Prime was now a ghost world, waiting for the storm to arrive. Lieutenant Laura Bennett sat at her sensor station, monitoring the approaching swarm. She reported that the Vorthok Vanguard would arrive in 6 hours. Her voice trembled slightly as she gave the numbers. Approximately 800,000 enemy vessels were heading toward them. Nathan nodded calmly. He had expected worse. He looked out at his fleet through the main viewport. 400 ships floated in formation around the Defiance. It was the largest human armada ever assembled. Destroyers and cruisers and carriers, some brand new from the shipyards and others pulled from retirement. Every vessel humanity could spare had been sent to Meridian. 400 against 800,000. Nathan understood the math. He also understood that math had never stopped humans before. He opened a communication channel to all ships. His voice reached every captain, every pilot, every Marine waiting in the deployment base. He told them what they already knew. In 6 hours, they would face an enemy that had never known defeat. An enemy that had consumed civilizations spanning thousands of years. An enemy that believed humans would run like everyone else. He paused and looked around his bridge at the young men and women serving under him. Some were barely 20 years old. They had signed up knowing they might not come home. He continued his speech. He told his fleet they were not fighting to win. They were fighting because surrender was not part of who they were. They were fighting to show the galaxy what happened when you threatened humanity. They were fighting because that was what humans had always done. The hours passed slowly. Crews prepared their weapons and checked their systems. Marines loaded their rifles and said quiet prayers. Some wrote letters to family members they might never see again. Others played cards or told jokes, trying to keep the fear at bay. Captain Kevin Brooks commanded a squadron of 12 destroyers on the left flank. His ships were old. Some of them converted cargo haulers, fitted with weapons that were barely adequate. His crew was a mix of experienced veterans and fresh recruits who had never seen combat. He walked through his flagship, talking to each station, making sure everyone was ready. His first officer, Lieutenant Amy Peters, asked him if he had any final orders. Kevin told her the orders were simple. When the enemy arrived, they would point their guns at them and fire until they could not fire anymore. If the ship was damaged, they would keep fighting. If the ship was boarded, they would fight with rifles. If their rifles ran out of ammunition, they would fight with knives. And if their knives broke, they would fight with their bare hands. Amy smiled despite her fear. She told him that did not sound like much of a plan. Kevin smiled back. He told her humans had won wars with worse plans. The Vorthik arrived exactly when the sensors predicted. They came out of hyperspace like a living storm, millions of ships made of organic material and metal fused together. Each vessel was different, shaped like insects or worms or creatures that had no name. They moved in perfect coordination, controlled by a hive mind that connected every drone to a central queen. General Nathan Cole watched them fill his viewport. For a moment, even he felt the weight of what they were facing. The swarm stretched from one end of visible space to the other. It was like staring at the end of the world. He gave the order to attack. The human fleet surged forward, engines burning at maximum power. They fired everything they had into the swarm. Missiles and railgun rounds and energy beams tore into the Vorthik formation. Enemy ships exploded by the hundreds. But for every ship destroyed, 1,000 more took its place. The battle became chaos within minutes. Human vessels weaved through swarms of enemy drones, firing in every direction. Ships collided and exploded. Communications became garbled with distress calls and battle reports. Captain Kevin Brooks led his destroyer squadron into the thickest part of the fight. His ships were too slow to dodge and too weak to absorb much damage. They took hits from every angle. Systems failed. Crew members died at their stations. But they kept fighting. Kevin ordered his helmsman to ram the nearest enemy cruiser. The impact tore through both ships, but Kevin survived. He grabbed a rifle from a fallen Marine and rallied the survivors. Vorthik boarders were already cutting through the hull. Insectoid creatures with razor-sharp limbs and no concept of mercy. He led his crew into the corridors to meet them. The fighting was brutal and close. Humans and Vorthik killed each other in the darkness of failing life support. Kevin shot and stabbed and punched his way through wave after wave of enemies. A young Marine named Danny Price fought beside him. Danny was 19 years old and had joined the fleet just 2 months ago. He was terrified. but he did not run. When his rifle jammed, he picked up a metal pipe and kept swinging. Kevin shouted encouragement to his crew. He told them the Vorthik were just bugs. Humanity had been killing bugs since they lived in caves. This was no different. The battle lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of constant fighting without rest or relief. Human ships fell one after another. The Defiance took critical damage, and General Nathan Cole ordered all non-essential crew to evacuate. He stayed on the bridge with his skeleton crew, directing the battle until the very end. When his ship finally exploded, he was still giving orders. Captain Kevin Brooks died defending the engine room of his destroyer. He took 17 Vorthik with him before they finally brought him down. Danny Price survived, dragged to an escape pod by another Marine, just before the ship broke apart. The human fleet was destroyed. 400 ships reduced to debris floating in the void around Meridian Prime, but they had taken 200,000 Vorthik vessels with them. The swarm paused after the battle. For the first time in their long history of conquest, they had encountered something unexpected. A species that did not flee. A species that fought to the death without hesitation. A species that killed 200,000 of their number with only 400 ships. The Vorthak Queen, who commanded the vanguard, sent a message back to the main swarm. She reported that the humans were more dangerous than anticipated. She recommended caution. The message spread through the hive mind, and for the first time in centuries, the Vorthik felt something they had never experienced before. Doubt. News of the Battle of Meridian spread across the galaxy. The alien species hiding in the Outer Rim heard what humanity had done. They heard how 400 ships had stood against 800,000. They heard how humans had fought in the corridors of their dying vessels rather than surrender. Ambassador Vrenthus of the Kelari received the report in his refugee quarters. He read it 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. His aide asked him what it meant. Vrenthus stared at the casualty figures. He said quietly that it meant the humans were either insane or the bravest species the galaxy had ever known. Perhaps both. Admiral Samantha Price stood before the United Nations Emergency Council in Geneva. Her uniform was torn and stained with grease and blood. She had not slept in 3 days. She had commanded the rear guard at Meridian, covering the escape pods as the fleet died around her. She had been one of the last humans to leave the battle. Now she was asking permission to go back and fight again. Secretary General Marcus Webb sat at the head of the long table. His face showed the exhaustion that every human leader felt. The loss at Meridian had hit Earth hard. Thousands of families had lost sons and daughters. The news channels played footage of the battle on constant repeat. But something else was happening too. Instead of despair, there was anger. Instead of fear, there was determination. Recruitment centers reported record numbers of volunteers. Factory production had tripled in the past week. Scientists were working around the clock to develop new weapons. Humanity was not breaking. Humanity was getting ready for round 2. Samantha activated a holographic display showing detailed scans of destroyed Vorthik vessels. She explained what they had learned from the battle. The Vorthik ships were organic, grown rather than built. They could regenerate damage, but the process was slow. More importantly, their command structure was centralized around queen vessels. Each queen controlled thousands of drones through a psychic link. Destroy the queen, and the drones lost coordination. Defense Minister Ashley Grant leaned forward with interest. She asked how difficult it would be to target these queen vessels. Samantha admitted it would not be easy. Queens were always surrounded by massive escorts. They stayed in the center of formations, protected by layer after layer of drones. A direct assault would be suicide. But there was another way. She changed the display to show a tactical map of Vorthik-controlled space. She proposed a new strategy. Instead of fighting defensive battles, humanity would go on the offensive. Small strike teams would slip behind enemy lines, hunt down Queen vessels, and destroy them before disappearing. Hit and run. Guerrilla warfare. The same tactics humans had used against each other for thousands of years. Marcus Webb asked her what kind of resources she would need. Samantha told him she needed fast ships, volunteer crews, and permission to operate independently. She did not need a large fleet. She needed hunters. Admiral Daniel Harper spoke up from his seat near the back of the room. He had survived Meridian by pure luck, evacuated against his will when his flagship was destroyed. He told the council that Samantha was right. The Vorthik expected them to defend and retreat. They did not expect humans to attack. The alien councils had sent messages urging humanity to accept their offer of sanctuary. They called the human strategy foolish and wasteful. They said more battles like Meridian would accomplish nothing except killing more humans. Ashley Grant mentioned these messages with frustration in her voice. She asked the council what they should tell the aliens. Daniel stood up and walked to the front of the room. He said they should tell the aliens nothing. The aliens had abandoned Earth when the threat arrived. They had no right to criticize how humans chose to fight. He looked around the room at the faces of humanity's leaders. He told them the truth they all knew. If humanity ran now, they would prove every alien right. They would become refugees, dependent on the charity of species who had shown them none. They would watch Earth die from a safe distance and spend the rest of their existence knowing they could have done something. Or they could fight. Marcus Webb called for a vote. The decision was unanimous. Humanity would continue the war. Samantha Price would lead the new strike force. Within a month, the first teams were ready. They flew ships modified for stealth and speed, stripped of unnecessary weight and loaded with weapons. Their crews were volunteers who understood they might not come home. They trained in secret bases hidden across human space, learning new tactics and studying Vorthik behavior. Lieutenant Commander Chris Martinez was one of the first team leaders selected. He was 32 years old, a veteran of the Colonial Patrol Service with a reputation for creative thinking. His crew of 50 had been handpicked from thousands of applicants. They called their ship the Silent Blade. Before their first mission, Samantha Price visited the team personally. She walked through the ship, shaking hands with every crew member. She told them what she expected. They were not soldiers anymore. They were hunters. Their job was to find Queen vessels, kill them, and escape before the swarm could respond. She warned them that most missions would be dangerous beyond anything they had trained for. She told them many teams would not survive. She asked if anyone wanted to reconsider. No one moved. Chris told her his team was ready. They had all lost someone at Meridian. Friends, family members, crewmates they had served with for years. They were not fighting for glory or medals. They were fighting for revenge. Samantha nodded. She understood that feeling well. The Silent Blade launched on its first mission 3 days later. They slipped past Vorthik patrols, using a combination of stealth technology and clever navigation. They spent 2 weeks behind enemy lines, mapping swarm movements and identifying Queen vessels. Their first target was a Queen ship orbiting a conquered world that had once belonged to the Pelori. The Queen was young, controlling only a few thousand drones. Her escort was light compared to more established Queens. Chris gathered his crew and explained the plan. They would approach from the shadow of a nearby moon, fire everything they had at the Queen, and run before reinforcements arrived. The whole attack would last less than 5 minutes. If anything went wrong, they were on their own. Sensor Officer Nicole Torres monitored enemy movements from her station. She reported when the escort pattern shifted, creating a brief window of vulnerability. Chris gave the order to attack. The Silent Blade emerged from cover at full speed. They launched missiles and fired railguns in a concentrated burst aimed directly at the Queen vessel. The Vorthic drones reacted immediately, swarming toward the human ship, but they were too late. The Queen vessel exploded in a flash of organic matter and burning gas. Across the nearby space, thousands of drones went mad. Without their queen to guide them, they lost all coordination. They crashed into each other, flew in random directions, and attacked anything that moved, including other Vorthak. Chris ordered an immediate retreat. The silent blade vanished into the darkness before the remaining Vorthak could organize a pursuit. They had done it. One small ship had destroyed a queen and thrown an entire sector into chaos. When news of the mission reached Earth, celebrations erupted. It was proof that the Vorthak could be hurt. It was proof that humanity could strike back. It was proof that the war was not hopeless. More teams launched in the following weeks. Some succeeded. Some never returned. But every mission taught humanity something new about their enemy. And slowly, the tide began to shift. The Vorthak had never faced an enemy like this. An enemy that did not wait to be attacked. An enemy that hunted them in the darkness between stars. For the first time in their long existence, the Vorthak were afraid. 6 months had passed since the Battle of Meridian. The war had changed completely. Human strike teams operated across Vorthak-controlled space like ghosts, appearing without warning and vanishing before the swarm could respond. They had destroyed over 200 Queen vessels and thrown dozens of sectors into chaos. Lieutenant Commander Chris Martinez and his crew aboard the Silent Blade had become legends. They had completed more successful missions than any other team. Their ship was battered and scarred from countless battles, but it still flew. Chris had lost 12 crew members over the months, but the survivors had become the most experienced hunters in the fleet. Today, they were stalking their most dangerous target yet. Nicole Torres sat at her sensor station, studying the readings on her screen. She reported that they had found a Supreme Queen, not an ordinary queen, but one of the ancient ones who commanded entire regions of the swarm. Killing her would disrupt Vorthak operations across 3 sectors. Pilot Jake Henderson whistled low from his position at the helm. He noted that the Supreme Queen was protected by at least 2,000 escort vessels. He asked Chris if he was serious about attacking. Chris studied the tactical display carefully. The Supreme Queen's ship was enormous, the size of a small moon. It pulsed with organic energy, connected to thousands of drones through psychic links that stretched across light years. Destroying it would be a massive blow to the Vorthik war effort. It would also be nearly impossible. He told his crew they were not going to attack directly. They would wait for an opportunity. Supreme Queens were arrogant. They believed nothing could threaten them. Eventually, she would make a mistake. They waited for 3 days, hidden in the shadow of a dead planet. They watched the swarm move around them. They studied patrol patterns and noted when escorts rotated positions. Chris barely slept, spending every hour looking for a weakness. On the 4th day, Nicole detected something unusual. A portion of the escort fleet was leaving. Apparently, another human strike team had hit a nearby system, and the Supreme Queen was sending reinforcements to hunt them down. The escort dropped from 2,000 ships to 800. Still overwhelming odds, but the best chance they would get. Chris gathered his crew in the small common area. He told them the situation honestly. 800 ships was still enough to destroy them many times over. If they attacked, they would probably die. But if they succeeded, they would cripple Vorthak operations in this entire region. He asked if anyone wanted to vote against the mission. Engineer Tony Reeves spoke up from the back. He said he had joined his crew to kill Vorthak. He did not join to play it safe. He voted to attack. One by one, the others agreed. Medic Sarah Lynn, Weapons Officer Danny Price, the young Marine who had survived Meridian. Navigation Specialist Beth Crawford. Every single crew member voted to attack. Chris nodded. He told them to prepare for combat. They would strike in 2 hours. The attack began at exactly midnight, ship time. The Silent Blade emerged from cover at maximum speed, running silent with all external systems shut down. They approached from the blind spot they had identified in the patrol pattern, slipping between escort ships that never saw them coming. Nicole called out the distance to target. 10,000 kilometers. 5,000. 2,000. Chris waited until they were close enough to see the Supreme Queen's ship with their own eyes. It was a massive creature, part vessel and part living being. Its surface crawled with smaller organisms, drones being grown for the endless war. He gave the order to fire. The Silent Blade unleashed everything it had. Missiles and railgun rounds and energy beams struck the Supreme Queen in a concentrated barrage. The creature screamed, a psychic cry that every crew member felt in their minds. Alarms blared as the escort ships finally detected them and began to converge. The first volley was not enough. The Supreme Queen was wounded but still alive. Chris ordered a second attack run, pushing the Silent Blade through a wall of defensive fire. The ship shook with impacts. Hull breaches opened on 3 decks. Tony Reeves reported that engines were failing. They fired again. This time, the missiles found a weak point, punching through the creature's armored hide and detonating inside its body. The Supreme Queen convulsed and began to break apart. Across the sector, millions of drones went silent. Without their Supreme Queen, they lost all direction. Some crashed into planets. Others simply stopped moving, floating dead in space. But the Silent Blade was not escaping. Jake reported that the main engine was destroyed. They had maneuvering thrusters only. The escort ships were closing fast, hundreds of them converging on the wounded human vessel. Chris ordered all hands to battle stations. If they could not run, they would fight. The Vorthik surrounded them within minutes. Smaller ships latched onto the Silent Blade's hull and began cutting through. Boarding parties poured into the vessel, insectoid warriors with claws and fangs designed for killing. The crew fought back with everything they had. Danny Price led a team of Marines to defend the bridge. Sarah Lynn set up a medical station in the corridor and treated wounded while firing her sidearm at any Vorthik that came close. Tony Reeves sealed engineering and fought alone against a dozen boarders until reinforcements arrived. Chris commanded from the bridge, directing the defense as sections of his ship fell one by one. He had accepted that they would not survive, but he was determined to make the Vorthik pay for every inch. The battle lasted for hours. The Silent Blade was torn apart deck by deck. Crew members fell defending their posts. But they did not surrender. They did not beg for mercy. They fought until they could not fight anymore. When the Vorthik finally breached the bridge, only Chris and Nicole were still standing. They had barricaded the doors with furniture and bodies. They were both wounded, bleeding from multiple cuts and burns. Chris told Nicole it had been an honor serving with her. Nicole smiled despite everything. She said the honor was hers. The doors exploded inward. Vorthik warriors flooded the bridge. Chris raised his rifle and fired. The transmission cut out. News of the Silent Blade's final mission reached Earth 3 days later. Admiral Samantha Price read the report in her office, tears streaming down her face. She had known Chris since he was a young ensign. She had watched him grow into one of the finest officers humanity had ever produced. But she also knew what he had accomplished. The Supreme Queen's death had devastated Vorthik operations in 3 sectors. Other human teams were reporting that enemy resistance was collapsing. The swarm was pulling back, regrouping, confused. She ordered a memorial service for the crew of the Silent Blade. Their names would be remembered forever. Ambassador Vrenthus received news of the battle in his refugee quarters in the Outer Rim. He stared at the report for a long time. 50 humans had attacked the Supreme Queen with 2,000 escorts. They had succeeded. They had all died, but they had succeeded. His aide asked him what he was thinking. Vrenthus set down the report. He said he was thinking that perhaps the Kelari had been wrong to run. He was thinking that perhaps it was time to stop hiding and start helping. He ordered his aide to prepare a message for Earth. The Kelari were ready to join the fight. They were not the only ones. Across the galaxy, other species who had fled were watching humanity's impossible war. They were seeing what courage looked like. And slowly, one by one, they were finding their own. 1 year had passed since the invasion began. Admiral Daniel Harper stood on the bridge of the UE's Constellation, humanity's new flagship. The ship was massive, built in secret shipyards that had worked without rest for 12 months. It represented everything humanity had learned about fighting the Vorthic. Behind the Constellation stretched a fleet of 3,000 human vessels. New designs equipped with weapons specifically created to kill Vorthic. Crews trained in the tactics that the strike teams had perfected. Every ship crewed by volunteers who had watched their world fight for survival and decided to join the battle. But humanity was no longer alone. Beside the human fleet flew alien vessels. The Kelari had sent 200 warships, their first military deployment in 3 centuries. The Pelori had committed their entire reserve fleet, 500 ships crewed by warriors who had watched humans die at Meridian and felt shame for running. Even the Makari, a species that had never fought a battle in their recorded history, had contributed transport ships for supplies and medical evacuations. Commander Katie Morrison stood beside Daniel on the bridge. She had aged a decade in the past year, her hair showing streaks of gray that had not been there before. But her eyes held a fire that burned brighter than ever. She reported that all ships were in position. The Allied fleet was ready for the final assault. Daniel nodded slowly. Intelligence had tracked the main Vortex swarm to their home system, a cluster of planets where the species had originated millions of years ago. The swarm was gathering there, preparing for a massive push toward Earth. If they succeeded, humanity would be finished. But if humanity struck first, while the swarm was concentrated, they could end the war in a single battle. Daniel opened a communication channel that broadcast to every ship in the fleet, to the resistance cells operating behind enemy lines, to every corner of the galaxy where someone might be listening. He began to speak. He reminded them of what had happened 1 year ago. He reminded them how the Galactic Council had told humanity to run, how every species had fled and left Earth to face the Vorthic alone. He reminded them of Meridian, where 400 ships had stood against 800,000. He reminded them of everyone who had died. General Nathan Cole, Captain Kevin Brooks, Lieutenant Commander Chris Martinez, and the crew of the Silent Blade. Thousands of others, whose names would never be forgotten. Then he told them why they were here today. They were here because humanity had refused to give up. They were here because when the galaxy abandoned them, they had found the courage to fight anyway. They were here because their stubbornness and determination had inspired others to find their own courage. He told them they were not fighting for revenge. They were fighting for the future. They were fighting so that no species would ever have to face the Vorthic alone again. He ended his speech with a simple order. All ships advance. The Battle of the Vorthic homeworld began with a coordinated strike from every direction. Human vessels led the charge, their new weapons tearing through swarm formations that had seemed invincible just months ago. Kelari plasma batteries burned through organic hulls. Pelori missiles struck Queen vessels with precision guidance developed by human scientists. The Vorthic fought back with everything they had. Billions of drones swarmed toward the Allied fleet. Queen vessels coordinated counterattacks that destroyed dozens of ships in seconds. The space around their homeworld became a storm of fire and death. Captain Scott Turner commanded the ground assault force. His Marines landed on the largest Vorthic planet in hundreds of dropships, fighting their way through tunnels filled with warrior drones. They were hunting the Supreme Queens who hid beneath the surface, directing the swarm from protected bunkers. Scott led from the front, as he always had. He had been a sergeant at Meridian, one of the few ground troops who survived when his transport was shot down. He had spent the past year fighting in every major engagement, promoted again and again as officers above him fell. Now he was leading the most important mission in human history. His Marines pushed through wave after wave of defenders. They used explosives and flamethrowers and anything else that could kill the insectoid warriors. They lost soldiers with every corridor they cleared. But they did not stop. Sergeant Megan Walsh fought beside Scott, just as she had since Meridian. She was wounded in 3 places but refused evacuation. She told Scott they had come too far to quit now. They found the first Supreme Queen in a massive chamber deep beneath the surface. She was ancient and enormous, her body connected to thousands of organic cables that linked her to the swarm above. Scott ordered his Marines to focus fire on her vulnerable points. The battle lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, the Supreme Queen was dead, and half of Scott's company had fallen with her. But there were more queens to hunt. In orbit, Admiral Daniel Harper coordinated the space battle from the Constellation's bridge. The fighting was the most intense he had ever witnessed. Ships exploded constantly on both sides. The tactical display was a chaos of markers representing life and death. Admiral Samantha Price commanded the strike force that was hunting the Vorthic Prime Queen, the oldest and most powerful of all the queens. She had personally led the assault, flying her flagship into the heart of the enemy formation. Her ship was destroyed within an hour of the battle beginning. But she had transferred to another vessel and continued the attack. When that ship was crippled, she transferred again. She would not stop until the Prime Queen was dead, or she was. The battle reached its climax 12 hours after it began. Scott Turner's Marines had killed every Supreme Queen on the planet's surface. The swarm above was falling into chaos. Individual queens fighting for control without central direction. And Samantha Price had finally reached the Prime Queen's vessel. The Prime Queen was a creature of nightmare, a being that had lived for millions of years and consumed countless civilizations. Her psychic power was immense, capable of controlling billions of drones across light years. She had never imagined that primitive beings from a small planet could threaten her existence. She learned differently today. Samantha ordered all nearby ships to concentrate fire on the Prime Queen's vessel. Human and alien weapons struck together, overwhelming the creature's defenses. The Prime Queen screamed as her ship began to break apart, her psychic cry echoing across the entire star system. When she died, the Vorthic swarm died with her. Across the homeworld system, billions of drones went silent. Ships stopped fighting and began drifting aimlessly. Warriors collapsed where they stood, their connection to the hive mind severed forever. The Vorthic, as a coordinated threat, ceased to exist. The battle was over. Humanity had won. 1 month later, Admiral Daniel Harper stood before the newly reformed Galactic Council. The chamber was full again, representatives from dozens of species filling seats that had been empty for a year. They watched the human delegation with something that had not existed before: respect. Ambassador Vrenthus of the Kalari approached Daniel after the formal ceremonies concluded. He asked a question that had bothered him since the war began. He asked how humans had known they could win when everyone else believed it was hopeless. Daniel thought about the question carefully. He thought about everyone who had died. He thought about the moments when defeat seemed certain and hope seemed foolish. He thought about the ordinary people who had refused to surrender, even when surrender was the logical choice. He told Renthis the truth. Humans had never known they could win. They had simply known they could not live with themselves if they ran. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the smartest or the oldest. But they were stubborn. They did not quit. And sometimes that was enough. Renthis considered this answer for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. He said the galaxy was fortunate that humans existed. He said he hoped his own species could learn from their example. Daniel told him they already had. The Kelari had fought bravely at the homeworld. Every allied species had contributed to the victory. Humanity had shown the galaxy what courage looked like, but the galaxy had found its own courage in the end. He looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates, species that had once abandoned Earth and now stood as allies. He thought about the future, about the challenges that still lay ahead, about the galaxy that humanity was now a permanent part of. They had survived the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. They had done it by refusing to give up when giving up was the easy choice. They had done it by being human, and that was something to be proud of.